Roman battles were ancient Rome's way of saying, let's fix problems by lining up and stabbing everything that moves. From far away, it looked smart. Up close, it was dirt, blood, and a wall of men shouting behind giant shields. It wasn't just war, it was a system built to crush anything slow, soft, or unlucky. And it only got stranger from there. Each legion, about 5,000 men, was sliced into tight little chunks called centuries, and each of those was led by a centurion, a man more dangerous than his title suggested. These were battlefield foremen with fists, and they made sure every helmet was on straight and every order followed. Formations moved like gears, shields locked, swords drawn, eyes ahead. One step off rhythm, and the man behind shoved forward without pause. These weren't villagers with pitchforks. They were a living wall of metal trained to stab, push, and advance in unison. The front ranks were often younger soldiers, still hopeful, still thinking they might make it home. Behind them stood the experienced ones, hardened by years and scars, and when everything else fell apart, the triarii waited at the back, quiet, steady, and ready to fix what others couldn't. When they stepped forward, it meant the line had snapped. The phrase, "It's come to the triarii," wasn't just a saying, it was a bad omen. But Rome didn't just rely on manpower, it brought order. Engineers were sent ahead of the army, not after. They leveled the land, drew maps, and built bridges before anyone set foot on the battlefield. Tents were arranged in identical patterns every night. A Roman camp wasn't a resting place. It was a fortress built overnight, complete with trenches, walls, towers, and watch rotations tighter than any palace guard. Everything had its place, including the enemy. And only then, when the ground was marked and the sun was up, did it start the killing. While other armies charged in with their loudest guy and biggest sword, Rome opened with a tactical warm-up called the pilum volley. That's the Roman javelin, and it wasn't meant to kill anyone. It was meant to ruin their gear and their day. The shaft bent on impact, which meant if it hit a shield, the enemy was now carrying a very awkward metal noodle. And good luck throwing it back. It snapped like a breadstick. Once the enemy was busy wrestling with their new floppy arm accessory, the Roman soldiers moved in, slow, steady, and as polite as a murder machine could be. They weren't screaming, they weren't charging, they were advancing in straight lines, shields locked, feet stomping like a human wall of knives. The gladius came out next. This wasn't a big, flashy sword. It was short, it was boring. It was made for getting up close and poking holes in people until they stopped moving. It stabbed straight in, low and fast, usually right under the ribs or into the belly. No swinging, no slicing, just step, stab, repeat. One expert called it meat grinding with extra steps. And because these soldiers packed in so tightly, they couldn't swing anyway. There wasn't enough room to even raise a hand properly. That's why the Romans drilled for hours to learn the simplest moves, because in battle, those were the only ones that fit. The shield wasn't just for defense, it was a weapon too. One soldier would bash the enemy in the face with the edge of it, stun them, and the guy next to him would stab. Then they'd switch, and stab again. The scutum, that big curved shield, worked like a battering ram. Whole formations would press forward, smash into the enemy line, and force them to stumble back into their own teammates. Now the enemy was panicking, tripping, falling, dying. Meanwhile, the Romans stayed calm. They rotated tired soldiers out and fresh ones in, like clockwork. Front line too bloody? Pull them back, next line steps in. No gaps, no mess. Just a conveyor belt of stabbing. Sometimes enemy armies fell apart before anyone even touched them. The sight of Roman legions marching in sync with raised shields and zero emotion was terrifying. They looked more like machines than men. Machines that smelled like sweat and onions, but still terrifying. And if the enemy did try something wild, like sending in horses to break the formation, the Romans smiled. They had spears ready. They had soldiers behind the lines with long sticks just for stabbing horses in the neck. No emotion, just business. The famous testudo, or tortoise, wasn't just a cool name. It was the ancient version of a tank. Soldiers locked their shields together on all sides and over their heads. Arrows bounced off. Rocks bounced off. One entire squad could walk right up to enemy walls while looking like a large metal loaf of bread. And when they got close enough, out came the hooks, picks, ladders, and the stabbing started again. But not all fighting happened on fields. Sometimes it happened in cities where things got even worse. Door-to-door combat, hallways packed with smoke, arrows flying from rooftops. Imagine a fistfight inside a burning house full of screaming strangers, except everyone's holding a sword. The Romans didn't like surprises, so they brought everything. Rams for gates, siege towers for walls, grappling hooks, fire pots, and if nothing else worked, they set stuff on fire, a lot of it. Inside the chaos, commanders stood on hills or towers yelling orders, using flags, horns, and runners to control the flow. If the battle looked like it was slipping, they'd signal a regroup. If victory was near, they'd send in the cavalry. Roman cavalry didn't fight fair. They didn't duel. They didn't chase honor. They chased survivors. Once an enemy line broke and started running, cavalry circled behind and cut off the retreat. It wasn't a chase. It was cleanup. The Roman goal was to destroy the enemy's will to fight. And nothing destroyed morale faster than watching horses slice through a crowd like scissors through paper. And when the killing finally stopped, when the dust settled and the ground was so soaked in blood that it squished when stepped on, that's when the legions formed ranks again, not to celebrate, but to count bodies, gather weapons, and prepare for whatever nightmare the next day would bring, because winning wasn't the end. Rome didn't stop after battle. They set up camp, dug trenches, posted guards. Even after surviving one of the worst days imaginable, a Roman soldier still had to put up a fence, and those not lucky enough to die in the heat of battle, they got rounded up, captured, enslaved, sometimes used for manual labor, sometimes sold, sometimes tossed into the arena later as practice for someone else. Rome didn't waste much, not even broken people. And if anyone thought the battle itself was terrifying, wait until they saw the things Rome did before the stabbing even started. Because this army wasn't just strong, it was cleverly and creatively sneaky. Roman warfare wasn't just about muscle, it was a toolbox of ugly tricks, dirty moves, and enough battlefield scams to make a modern general cry. Let's begin with ambushes. Rome didn't always show up with drums and banners. Sometimes they hid, behind hills, inside forests, underground if needed. One unit would lure the enemy into a chase, look scared, run away, and once the enemy got far enough in, boom. Out came hidden troops from the sides, from the back, from everywhere. 1 minute, the enemy thought they were winning. The next, they were surrounded by people who definitely weren't tired and definitely weren't happy. Then there were pre-dug traps. Rome loved digging. If the enemy had to cross open ground, the Romans would dig camouflage spike pits, cover them with thin brush or fabric, then watch as attackers fell in and turned into meat skewers. Sometimes these pits were arranged in patterns, so enemy horses would hit them in waves. One fell, the next crashed into it, and so on. A perfect little pile of limbs and confusion. And that wasn't even the weirdest thing they buried. Ever hear of caltrops? They were small spiky things, tossed on the battlefield. No matter how they landed, one sharp point always stuck up. Anyone stepping on it, soldier, horse, or poor messenger boy, was instantly out of the fight, and probably limping home with tears in their sandals. But traps weren't just in the ground. Rome also played tricks with the sky. They used fire, a lot. Flaming arrows, flaming pots, flaming carts. Basically, if it could burn, Rome figured out how to launch it over a wall. Imagine a city watching the sky, only to realize that today's weather forecast is raining oil and death. And let's talk about siege warfare, because if anyone thought hiding inside a city meant safety, Rome had news. It didn't, not even close. Roman siege tactics turned waiting into war. The army outside didn't just knock politely at the gate. They brought rams, catapults, siege towers, fire, and if all else failed, hunger. Starving an enemy out took patience. But the Romans had patience. They'd build a wall around the wall, called a circumvallation, so nobody could escape. No supplies in, no messages out. Anyone trying to sneak food in probably got turned into a warning sign for everyone else. Meanwhile, the engineers went to work. Rome had engineers in the army like chefs in a kitchen. Tunnels? They dig under the walls and collapse them. Siege ramps? They'd build giant slopes to roll up battering rams the size of elephants. Siege towers? Basically tall wooden buildings full of angry people who wanted to climb over your wall and ruin your whole week. And if the defenders somehow held out for weeks or months, the attackers got mad. And when the Romans got mad, they got creative. There's one famous trick: burning pigs. No, seriously. They covered pigs in pitch, lit them on fire, and sent them squealing toward enemy war elephants. The sound, the fire, the chaos, it spooked the elephants so badly they sometimes turned around and crushed their own army. Flaming bacon bombs. That's Roman thinking. They also weaponized fear. Soldiers sometimes painted their faces, wore animal skins, or banged weapons on shields to sound like monsters. It was all about shaking the enemy's nerves. If a Roman soldier could make an enemy doubt, even for a second, that was 1 second closer to winning. And when cities finally fell, Rome made sure the next town heard about it. Heads on spikes, gates covered in enemy banners. Sometimes entire cities were burned as a message. Resist us? This is what's left. Simple, loud, effective. Even outside of battles, Roman military leaders played tricks. They forged enemy messages, paid off local tribes to betray their allies, sent spies dressed as merchants into towns. Rome didn't care how the wind came, as long as it came. Even weather got used. Roman generals timed attacks for foggy mornings or at night. Some armies refused to fight in the rain. Romans said, "Perfect. Let's go." There are stories of soldiers hiding in swamps for hours, covered in mud, just to pop out and scare the sandals off someone walking by. And once in a while, Rome pulled the most brutal trick of all, letting the enemy win just a little, a staged retreat, a weak point in the line, a sudden collapse. The enemy would think, "We've got them," and rush in, right into a trap. Hidden cavalry on the flanks, fresh troops waiting behind the hill, spears already pointed, and in seconds, cheers turned to screams. But not every plan worked. Not every trick landed. Because sometimes, despite all the planning, the Roman war machine walked into a disaster it couldn't fix. Weather changed, horses slipped, scouts failed, and once that delicate rhythm of discipline and timing snapped, it all went downhill. One mistake and a perfectly placed legion could collapse faster than a cheap stool. It didn't even need to be a big error, a misread signal, a commander too eager, a unit that turned too early. Suddenly, the whole formation folded in on itself like a broken sandwich. And when formations broke, the Roman soldier became just another guy in the dirt, swinging a short sword and hoping his helmet was on straight. Take any of Rome's worst defeats and you'll find the same recipe: overconfidence, misjudged terrain, and someone forgetting they were mortal. Forests were a classic death trap. Tight spaces made neat rows useless, and tree branches didn't care about training. One ambush in the wrong valley, and a whole legion could vanish under a pile of screaming mud and bad luck. And elephants. Rome hated elephants. Everyone thought they were cool, until they ran through friend and foe like bowling balls made of meat. Sometimes they turned too early. Sometimes they turned too late. Sometimes they just turned around. A single panicked elephant could crush 100 men in armor who never saw it coming. Even fire tricks sometimes backfired, literally. Once, a gust of wind blew flaming tar back into the Roman lines, setting their own siege ramps on fire. Soldiers leapt into moats to escape the flames, only to realize the moats were filled with other soldiers doing the exact same thing. Chaos doesn't need an invitation. It just shows up. And when things went really wrong, when legions broke and commanders fell, the empire scrambled. Soldiers scattered, supplies got left behind, and enemy tribes chased them across rivers and hills, laughing the whole way. Rome didn't always look like a superpower. Sometimes it looked like a group of tired men trying not to cry while carrying 50 pounds of wet armor uphill. But even in disaster, Rome never stayed down for long. One loss didn't mean retreat, it meant revenge. Rome sent another legion, then another, then another. And while the enemy celebrated their victory with dancing, the Romans came back with maps, measurements, new bridges, and a better plan. Because that's what made Rome so dangerous. Not strength, not size. It was the obsession with learning from pain. Every ambush they walked into became a drill. Every defeat became a strategy lesson. Someone once said Rome didn't make the same mistake twice. That was wrong. They made it 3 times, maybe 4. But by the 5th, they came back, fixed it, and burned your house down just to be sure. And when the dust finally settled, after the enemy was gone, after the ground stopped bleeding, after the victory feast was packed up and the fires went out, then came the aftermath. Roman survivors didn't just go home and nap. First, they gathered the wounded. Then, they stripped the dead, collected weapons, counted coins. Every sword had value. Every helmet had use. They cleaned the field like a second army of janitors with PTSD. Next came the heads, literally. Heads were trophies, warnings, or sometimes just evidence, carted back to base, stacked by gates, or sent home to prove the job was done. The more organized the army, the more organized the piles. Then they rebuilt. They rebuilt everything. Broken walls, burned bridges, roads smashed by catapults. If a town had been flattened, Rome either paved it, renamed it, or left it as a skeleton reminder of what happens when someone says no too loud. And the soldiers? Most didn't get medals. They got dirt, scars, and maybe some stolen jewelry if the loot gods were kind. A few got land as retirement. Most didn't live that long. The army was a job with one rule: fight and maybe live. Don't fight, and definitely don't live. In the end, the Roman battlefield wasn't a story of glory. It was a factory. A bloody, creaky, sand-covered factory that produced one thing: control. It didn't care if people liked Rome. It didn't care if they remembered the names of the fallen. It only cared that they obeyed. That's what actually happened in Roman fights and battles. No magic swords, no noble speeches, just discipline, brutality, and the sound of iron scraping across bone. So next time someone says ancient warfare was about honor, maybe remind them that Rome once burned pigs alive, stabbed everything in sight, and kept a pile of enemy heads by the door, just in case someone forgot who was in charge. Because in the world of Rome, the only thing scarier than the fighting was what happened after it was done.